was who? What was her name?
Driscoll, Frances Urbana Driscoll.
And her nickname?
Fritz.
Okay, now, who were her mother and father?
Well, John Callahan Driscoll was her father, and Flanagan.
Sarah. Sarah Flanagan?
Catherine
Flanagan, yeah. And she had an uncle, Frank Flanagan, with her mother and dad.
Now, did you know them?
I vaguely remember my grandfather Driscoll. I can't remember a lot of details about him, but he was a quiet person. Quite the opposite of his children, I would say. Not that they were unquiet, let's say, but he wasn't an outgoing person, as I remember. But I'm talking about when I was a small child.
Did your mom ever talk about his politics or who his friends were or why he had become a socialist?
Well, not really. He wasn't in agreement, all she ever said, with the politics at the time, you know, I mean, he had ideas in his mind for changes, what they were, I don't know. And he wasn't really successful as a politician. I know she once said he told her, if you want to know how many friends you have, just run for office. You'll find out quick.
And what did he do for a living?
He was a hoisting engineer for the company. That's all I remember. He was a good carpenter. In fact, I think he built 2 houses. The one they lived in when he died, and the one they lived in before they moved into that. It might have been 3, but 2 that I'm sure of were in the 700 block there on Broadway.
And then your grandmother, Driscoll, what do you remember of her?
Well, she was a real nice person. When our mothers and fathers would get on us, well, we ran to Grandma. Grandma took our part. She was an excellent cook. I mean, she was a real, more or less quiet person, but the door was always open. She was, like I say, in any difficulty you had, she took your side. The heck with the parents, whether it worked or not, I don't know.
And you had a dog named Freckles?
Well, with that, we had, Freckles really belonged to Sheila, I think. I had a dog, Rags. Of course, this was when I got to be about 6 years old. This sister of Dad's, Kate, and her husband they were dog lovers, and Joe Thomas, that was Kate's husband, got these 2 Chesapeake pups, and he gave me one, and they kept one. And mine got run over by the ice truck, broke his hip. Dad and Joe were going to put him to sleep. I raised hell until they put a cast on his leg, which was unheard of in those days on a dog. He ran around with that 50 pounds of plaster on his hind leg for about 5 months, and he survived. He didn't have full use of his leg, but he lived to be about 16 years old.
And then, now, who do you have for brothers and sisters? How many brothers and sisters?
6 brothers and sisters,
They
3 of each. It was Mary Lou and Francie, Bill, Dick, Sheila, and Eddie.
And how many of those were physicians?
Just one, Bill.
Bill?
Mm-hmm.
And then, how many kids do you have?
9. 2 boys and 7 girls.
And are any of them in Butte now?
One's in Butte. Michelle, the second one. She worked for the Head Start. She's a teacher's aide at the Head Start.
And then, now, who did you marry?
Madeline Shannon. Her dad was a contractor here in Butte. Her grandfather was a very staunch Union man.
Her grandfather? And his name was what?
Joe Shannon.
Okay, now, is he the one that was in the legislative delegation
Yeah.
that got the 8-hour day? Did you ever talk to him about
Oh,
that?
yeah.
What do you remember of Joe Shannon?
Joe Shannon was Union, right from the core. Joe Shannon walked down the street, ran into somebody, whether he knew him or not. First question he asked him what union he belonged to. And if they didn't belong to a union, they got a lecture about why they should and what would happen if they didn't. And he was blackballed by the company here in Butte to the point that he moved to Seattle. He lived in Seattle, in fact. When Madeline and I were first married, we lived in Seattle. And he was there at the time, and he couldn't drive a car, didn't own a car, but I used to drive him around, and he'd go here and there and just see what was going on. It was all Union with Joe.
So when did he leave you for Seattle? About?
Oh, I'd say he was back at, his wife died when his children, or when my father-in-law was young. In fact, she died when her youngest child was born. And he moved around quite a bit then because he couldn't work here. The family was here and raised by, well, the older children in the family raised the younger ones, and he took care of them, good care of them. They had a housekeeper or somebody to take care of them. He worked all over. He worked in the woods. He was up in Alaska, and in Seattle, and he'd come back here. Well, then when Charlie, my father-in-law, started in the construction business, he would come back and work for him off and on. But that was seasonal work, so it wasn't he'd come and he even lived. I can remember before Madeline and I got married, he was living there in the house.
About what year was that?
Oh, that was like in 38, 37, 38. In fact, in the family there was 4 boys. There was Richard, Charlie, and Tom, and I can't remember the 4th one's name. And then there was 3 girls. And at odd times, off and on, that house of Charlie's, Charlie, my father-in-law, and the mother-in-law had 4 surviving children. They had 7, but 3 died. And at odd times, they had 2 or 3 of Charlie's brothers or sisters living with them, plus the grandfather. And he spent most of the last part of his life in Seattle, and he died out there. They cremated him and threw his ashes in the Puget Sound.
So, now what was the cause of him going out to Seattle? What happened here?
Well, he was with the Union movement and got blackballed, so he went wherever he could find something to do. And in fact, when he had gone out there early on, when the IWW was real active, I don't know how much activity he was involved in with that, but they were busy in the woods, in the timber industry. And when Charlie, the father-in-law, he was born in Tacoma because they happened to be, that's where he was at that time. But they moved around. They was always some part of the family in Butte, but after the kids were born. But he traveled around the country because it was difficult when you couldn't work here, to find a...
So Charlie would have been born about when? When would they have been in Tacoma?
Oh, 1895, 96.
Okay, so he was moving around even before the 20th century.
Yeah.
So didn't he have to leave town the night that Frank Little got killed?
Yeah, his name was...
Did he ever tell you about that?
Well, he didn't ever go into many details, but he did tell me himself that his name was on the list. He was going to be next or somewhere down the list when Frank Little got killed. You see, he was one of I'm not positive with this, but a large family in Ireland, probably 12, 14 kids. Well, they were involved in the trouble in Ireland, and they had to leave there because his father built a causeway in Ireland for some English company, and when he got through with the thing, there was some difficulty. They wouldn't pay him. Well, then there was trouble over that. They were blowing things up, and they were having, well, there was trouble in the whole country. Well, some of the family went to Canada, the children. Some went to Australia, and Joe, first place he hit was in Iowa, and he was, I don't know how old he was, but he was pretty young then, in his teens, and he got on this farm. This couple had this farm, and they had a couple of little kids. Well, he worked there for that guy, and then something happened to the farmer, and he died. I don't know what, accident or sickness or something. The family was destitute. They didn't have any money or anything, so they just moved off the farm. And he did tell me about, he hitched up the team in the wagon, and they put what they could load in the wagon and just abandoned the farm, and he took them into, I don't know what town it was, but, and he left. He saw that they were safe there, somebody to take care of them, and he left them there, and then he migrated on out into, I believe he was in Park City and wherever there was mining, you know, he moved around quite a bit, but he was real active in the union movement.
Did he ever talk about who some of his friends were that he trusted here in Butte?
Not to me, John. I never got into that with him.
Did he